Hi everyone, my name is Gideon, and in today's episode I'd like to show you how I've built this shelf that also doubles as a cat tree or cat shelf, depending what you call it. Now, the problem that I have with a lot of cat furniture is that you end up looking like you're living in a pet shop, which is what I was trying to get away from when building the shelf. It is also my entry for the Bentwood challenge, the Rockler Bentwood challenge, which is a challenge online that is run along with the guys from Modern Maker podcast. So sit back, relax, and I'll show you how I've done it. So I started by designing the whole shelf in SketchUp just to make sure that I got the basic geometry right, especially the radius of the corners. Now I needed a mold to bend the wood around, which will be the first thing that I'll be making. And for that I used 3 layers of 18mm MDF to give me the correct width. For the MDF, I just bought this from a local hardware store and I had them cut it to length and width, which just saves me from having to do it. And then I found this roll of tape to be the closest round object in my workshop with 80mm radius, which is what I designed it to. And after some measuring and marking, I simply cut the corners of all 3 pieces of MDF using my jigsaw, and I took care just to leave a little bit of material proud, as I wanted the router to take this to the exact dimension. Using the same roll of tape along with the router, I transferred the radius onto a piece of scrap plywood, and in turn I used the piece of plywood to transfer that corner onto my first piece of MDF that I use as a master. I then used this first piece of MDF as my template to cut the corners of the remaining 2. And you'll notice that I use quite a lot of clamps and screws whilst doing this. And this is just to ensure that I've got a very tight fit, which will give me an accurate transfer of the router cut across all 3 pieces of MDF. You see in many videos that people cut holes in their molds to allow for clamps, so I thought I'd do the same, but after cutting the first hole I realized it would be just much quicker to cut out the whole center of the mold, so I did. I started using the jigsaw for this, but then soon realized that it would be much quicker to break out the circular saw and do it properly. It also gave me more flexibility as to where I could put my clamps. The last step was to mount the entire mold onto a mounting board, and I made sure to leave a 5mm gap between the mold and the mounting board. And this was just to ensure that there was extra material left when it came to routering it flush. If it doesn't make sense now, don't worry, it will become clear later in the video. Now that the mold is ready and clamped securely to the bench, I can start to prepare for steaming some wood. I've decided to, instead of building a steaming chamber, as many people do, to use plastic sleeves, which is a method that I've seen a couple of years ago on a guy's YouTube channel called Tips from a Shipwright, which is a great channel with loads of handy, very detailed tips on building boats. Now, prior to this, I have never done any steaming or bending of wood, so I thought that it would be good to just do a test run. So for my first attempt, I used a 10mm thick piece of oak trim that I got from the hardware store, and I made 2 plastic sleeves, one for each end, using a thicker gauge dust sheet and some duct tape to seal the ends. Then I clamped it onto my mold. To deliver the volume of steam that I needed, I used a wallpaper steamer and simply stuck the end of the pipe into the one end of the sleeve and tightened it up with duct tape. Now, I won't lie, at this point of the game I was really excited to just crack on because the mold is something that's a little bit boring to do and you want to get steaming. So I was so happy to see that the sleeve was filling up, so much so that I had to cut a little pressure release in the opposite side of the sleeve just to make sure that it doesn't burst. It soon became apparent that the heat of the steam was melting the glue of the tape, which meant that it kept on leaking and I had to keep on patching it with tape as I went along. So it's not the prettiest solution, but it's the first time I'm doing it and it worked, so it really doesn't matter. After 15 minutes, I simply couldn't wait any longer and I put on some gloves and gave it a go. Now, I had to remind myself that this is a test piece, not to get stressed about it.
And the purpose of it is to get a feel for the wood and a feel for how easy or difficult it is. Now, although I had a surface break on this side, when I repeated it on the other side using a already made plastic sleeve that I had left over from delivery of roller blinds and kept especially for this purpose, I didn't have any breaks on that side, and after doing both these sides it felt like I was ready to give it a go with the actual veneer. I'm very fortunate that Capital Crispin Veneer is very close to me here in London, and they have one of the widest ranges of veneers probably in Europe, with a history going back to the year 1900, tons of knowledge and extremely helpful staff that works for them. Now, I wanted a high contrast in color, so I went for a light ash and a very dark fumed oak, which fortunately are also both wood species that are known for their bending capacity. Now, with veneer, obviously it's not a machined material like MDF or plywood. So they all come in different sizes and widths. And as I knew I needed a fair chunk of material, I bought a bundle of each wood species because it's cheaper to buy a whole bundle. I then, when I got home, just lay them out on the grass using insulation panels, straight edge and my circular saw to cut it into more manageable widths before I could start steaming them. One thing that did save me a bit of time was clamping the sheets together before ripping them with a circular saw, so I didn't have to make multiple rips and I could just make a couple. Also, just important to remember is that you are not cutting down the material to the exact width that you need, which in my case was 54 millimeters. You want to leave it wider with at least 10 millimeters so that you could router it down to size later on. As you can imagine, at this point, the only thing that I wanted to do was just get steaming. But what I was considering here is whether or not it is possible to bend all 4 pieces of veneer at the same time, or if I had to do them individually, which would have added quite a lot of time to the total process. And I think this is where the value of doing a test piece first becomes quite apparent, because based on that I decided to just go for it. And my reasoning was that the test piece was 10 millimeters thick, which is 4 times bigger than these 2.5 millimeter pieces of veneer. My steaming time on the test piece was 15 minutes. I decided just to up that to 25 minutes to give it a bit more time in the bag. And then also to use the solid sleeves that I had left over from the roller blinds rather than making up new ones from scratch. This is such a rewarding part of the process. The smell that comes out of the bag, the pliability of the wood, it's just nice. And I think this method using a bag is in some ways better than using a chamber, especially for a hobbyist woodworker. And there are a couple of reasons I say this. The first one is the chamber, except for the fact that you have to build it first, takes quite a lot of storage space, which if you're only going to do it every now and then, you don't really need. Secondly, you need less steam because you can make the bag so it fits around the piece of wood that you're steaming rather than having to fill a whole chamber with steam. And also, and this is probably the biggest one, is that you can absolutely take your time when doing the bend and putting the clamps on, because the heat remains in the bag and the bag remains on your piece, which is different than when you're working with a chamber where you remove the piece of wood, the wood immediately starts cooling and you have to work very quickly, and often the wood loses its pliability before you can get the bend set properly. A couple of things to be aware of, as you can see in this shot, is that the wood is very soft because of the steam, so I made sure to use loads of spacers when clamping it down as not to dent the surface of the wood. I'm also making sure that the veneer is covering the whole of the mold by pressing it down all the way to the face of the mounting board, which means that I'll have enough material to router back when I do so later on in the video. After about 30 minutes I removed the piece from the mold, but before I removed the final couple of clamps I just made sure to draw a couple of references on the inside layer of veneer as well as the mold, so that when it comes to gluing it up I make sure that I'm putting it in exactly the same position. You can see when I remove the last clamp here, there's quite a lot of spring back in the piece. At this point I'm not worried about it because I know I still need to glue it back up in the same position, and also I'll be using these aluminium stretchers to make sure the piece is nice and tight when all glued up. After carefully removing the last bit of sleeving, I just put it aside safely so it could dry overnight before I could start gluing it up the next morning. Now this brings us to what was probably my least favorite part of the build, both because it was repetitive and slightly tedious, but also it was the one place where you could easily fuck up the whole thing. And that was making sure that each one of the 4 layers were cut to their exact length before I could start gluing it up. For this I just took my time and clamped each layer back into position, and using a very sharp Stanley knife to cut the ends square so that they meet exactly. For the first layer, this was the most important because once the shelf is mounted, you'd be able to see this joint from the inside. By the time I got to the glue up, I was quite relaxed because I've clamped and unclamped these layers now so many times during the steaming and the cutting that I knew roughly how long it took to assemble the whole piece. For the glue I picked a simple PVA, partly because I had some in the shop, but also it has a longer curing time, which means you don't have to rush or be worried that the glue will start going off as you assemble the layers, because it does take a while. It took me about 25 minutes to do all of this. As long as you make sure that your clamps are ready and that you have enough glue kind of poured out so that you don't have to stop and redo it again, you'll be fine. And to ensure that I had a good bond, I just applied glue to both sides of each layer, and I used as many clamps as I could fit onto the mold and made sure I tightened it very well. After letting the piece sit for 24 hours, I removed the clamps and also removed the actual mold from its mounting plate so that I could easily router it down to size using a flush trim router bit. You'll notice here that I still use clamps to keep the piece attached to the mold. This is just to prevent the piece from slipping and the router cutting gouges on the side of it. Moving on to sanding, everybody's favorite bit of a project. I keep my sanding paper in this tidy checkbook holder organized by grit. Obviously completely obsolete now as nobody uses checks anymore, but it's perfect for this. Because the veneer is relatively smooth, I started with 100 grit and then worked my way up through 120 or 180 and finished it with a 240. Now, if I apply oil finish to wood, I never go higher than 240 because it seems like the oil doesn't soak into any wood that has been sanded finer than a 240 grit. For the edges, I just did it by hand sanding, just as it gives me a bit more control, and I didn't want to round the edges, which happens very quickly if you do it by machine. The next step was to glue in the aluminium stretchers, which the purpose of these are twofold. First of all, they are the supports on which all of the shelves will rest, but then just as importantly, they also will help the piece retain its exact width as per the design and counter any kind of spring back that there might be. To do this, I cut a piece of plywood to exactly the same width as my mold, and then I cut 3 pieces of wood from this to use as spacers. Now, you'll notice that the cuts are not the straightest, but it doesn't matter as the length is the only accurate dimension that we need in this case. By clamping the 3 spaces right next to the stretchers, it means that I've set the width to the exact measurement and is now ready to glue. For this, I used a water-activated polyurethane glue by Gorilla, which is the perfect glue for this application. Firstly, I applied the glue to the inside of the hole, and then I dripped water on the aluminium rod before pushing it in. I made sure to leave the rods just a little bit proud before cutting it back with a hacksaw, and then to finish them off, I just sanded it back with a sander. By now both pieces were starting to look quite good, but I still had a bit of repair work to do where the layers didn't laminate 100% on each of the corners. I thought these gaps were a little bit too big to try and fill with a mix of glue and sawdust, so I decided to pre-bend 2 pieces of veneer by putting them in a carrier bag, steaming them for, I think it was about 10 minutes, and clamping them onto the corners of my mold. This way I was guaranteed to have a shape very, very close to the length of the gaps that I wanted to fill. And then it was really just a matter of cutting it down with a Stanley knife bit by bit until I had a nice tight fit, gluing it in and then letting it dry overnight. For the smaller gaps, I did use a mix of glue and sawdust and simply just rubbed it in, also let it dry. And then the next day I just planed it flush with a small block plane and finished it off with a little bit of sandpaper. Then it was time to move on and finish the 3 shelves. Here I'm just taking my time to pick the best and the worst sides because I could laminate over any blemishes, leaving the nicer size exposed as the bottom of the shelves. When designing it, I thought I'd be able to get away with just cutting slots for the laminated wood pieces to fit into, but with the top shelf being so close to the actual bend, it just wouldn't fit, and I had to cut the slots all the way through to make it work. Then as far as sanding was concerned, I just worked my way up gradually from 100 grit, finishing in a 240 grit, giving me a very nice smooth finish. To cut the linoleum to size, I find that laying it flat out on the grass is much easier than working with it on the bench in the workshop, and it is also less likely to pick up any scratches. Now, I'm always a little paranoid when cutting things like this to size because I don't know, I'm just always scared that I'm cutting it too small. So I leave quite a lot of material as a margin for error to work with. Now, there are 3 tips that I'd just like to highlight when cutting linoleum. The first one is to use a brand new blade. You definitely don't want to try and cut this with a blunt blade. Secondly, it's better to cut multiple times than try to slice through it in one single go. And then lastly, cutting it from the reverse side, I find it's much easier because the backing paper is quite thick, and once you get through that, you can literally just crack the linoleum on that line, and it is a much easier way than doing it from the front. Now that I had all the pieces cut, it was time to laminate them onto my shelves. Now, as I had enough clamps and as the shelves are not that big, I decided to again use a PVA. But I've done larger pieces before where it wasn't possible to clamp them, and for that I used a contact adhesive, and that works just as well. Here you can see I just used my forearms to push out any air bubbles. You can also use a kitchen rolling pin if you have one. I just didn't, and it works absolutely fine. Then I simply clamped them together using loads of clamps. Just remember again to use scrap bits of wood when you do so, as not to dent the surface of the wood. The next morning I just removed my clamps and checked for overall adhesion before routering off the excess using my trim router. Then to give it the final edge, I just ran my block plane at a 45-degree angle before giving it a quick sand, and then finishing the corners that I couldn't reach with the router with a chisel. Turning my attention back to the Bentwood pieces, I quickly drilled some mounting holes, making sure that they are right behind where the shelves go, so that it is not visible once the shelf is mounted. And here I'm just countersinking the holes so that the rim of the plastic plug doesn't show when you look at the shelf from the side. That exciting moment in a project that never seems to get old, when you apply the first layer of finish and you could see the color and the grain just pop, and you get an idea of what it's going to look like when you're completely finished with it. As with most of my other projects, I just use a matte oil from Osmo and I apply it with non-abrasive pads. It works wonderfully. And you can even see the plywood edges. The contrast of the layers just shows up really, really nicely, and I'm very happy with how the finish came out. Now at this point the bookshelf is completely done and you can put books on it. But obviously I want to combine it with a cat tree. So I just took measurements using some of the abrasive pads to just eyeball where I thought the gap should go. And you'll notice here that the top shelf is MDF, and that is just so that I could do some rough cuts and play around with the size of the gap and get some user acceptance testing done. Now, the client seemed happy, so I moved on to cutting the final template using a second piece of MDF, and then I used this to router out the final gaps in all 3 of the shelves. And after a quick sand and a bit of oil, the shelves were now completely finished.
Well guys, that is it from me this week. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please send around, click on subscribe, click on the bell button. I'll be doing another Bentwood project in due course. Until next time, goodbye.